Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for attending the live recording of our trustee talks for the Kent Archaeological Society. And of course, for those of you watching the recording, thanks for you too, attending this event and taking interest in our work. The Kent Archaeological Society exists to promote the understanding of the history and archaeology of the ancient county of Kent. And you can find out more about our work on our website. And for those who are not members, it would be very good for you to consider joining and supporting our work. We've been in existence now since 1857, and so we have a long and distinguished history, and we hope to continue. This evening, we are really privileged to have one of our longest serving members, Rod LeGear. Rod LeGear has been, in fact, a member of the Kent Archaeological Society since, I believe, 1963 or 1964. Rod is a retired engineer, although he started his working life in the Ordnance Survey, where he attained a good grounding in surveying and cartographic draftsmanship. And his interest in archaeology started when, as a schoolboy, he explored the many dene holes near Pexley with his friends and a length, as he says, of dubious rope. Two local archaeologists and Kent Archaeological Society members, the late John and Esther Kager, took him under their wing, and he was invited to help them on several medieval excavations in northwest Kent, as well as assisting John to record many underground sites. And that's as a result of that why he joined the Kent Archaeological Society. He has in fact served on the council since 1983, and then again in 2013 he was elected a vice president, and he's a member of the Industrial Archaeology Committee. Until recently, he has been a member of the Fieldwork Committee, and that was since 1985. He is also a member of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. He's the chairman of the affiliated society, the Kent Underground Research Group, which he founded in 1982 to promote the recording of underground heritage in the county. So there are few, in fact probably no one better qualified to speak about the subject that Rod will be speaking about tonight: underground Kent, Kent's hidden heritage. It'll be very good for those who do watch this on our YouTube channel to like and give us the thumbs up, and also to leave any comments there. Now I pass over to Rod LeGear to talk about underground Kent, Kent's hidden heritage, and there is an opportunity to ask questions in the question box, and I'll ask those at the end to Rod, and hopefully he'll be able to give you answers. Thank you very much. Rod.
Good evening. Man has actually dug under Kent for generations and generations, and they've left lots of underground space for us to discover now. Now, some of these cavities that have left are quite big. The one on the left is a chalk mine at St Peter's, the Broadstairs. The small one is a small drainage channel known as Frank Illingworth's Tunnel at Pegwell Bay, often called a smuggler's tunnel, but in fact was a drainage tunnel for a cottage now long demolished up on the cliff. Now the trouble with going underground is you've got to be very careful, and we have to be very careful with health and safety. And the Kent Underground Research Group has got quite a thick investigation procedures and safety protocols. You can't just dash underground with a candle and an old bicycle helmet or something. You have to take a lot of care, because there are a lot of hazards. There you see a shaft. Now, going up and down a shaft, you've got the danger of possibly falling off the ladder, so you have to be specially roped up. Also at the bottom of the shaft is quite a dangerous area, because if anything falls down the shaft, it accelerates as it comes down and can do you serious harm. This photograph is taken down an excavation we were doing in a well. At the bottom you can see a wooden platform. The excavator, when sending stuff up in a bucket, goes underneath that platform to avoid anything falling down. Also, in that particular case, we had to pump in fresh air all the time, because old wells, especially those dug in chalk, often fill up with carbon dioxide. So therefore, it's hazardous to us, so we have to pump the air out. And also we have to go through some tight tunnels. This one is an old building stone mine near Westerham. I was a lot younger then. I actually had dark hair. Also, some of the tunnels we go through are a bit unsafe. So we have to have the skills to decide what is too unsafe and what we can go through carefully. First, we'll talk about extraction. There are two reasons for digging holes in the ground. One is you want to get something out of the ground, and the other is you want the underground space. So we look at extraction first. One of the first things that man ever dug out of the ground was water for wells. In Kent, there are thousands of wells, because before the coming of mains water, you had to get your water either from a river or a well. Most of these wells now are all capped over and long forgotten, but occasionally they make their presence known again. This one opened up in the middle of a school playing field on Thanet. This is the members of the Kent Underground Research Group going down the shaft. And there is the subsidence, and that's looking down the shaft. Rather unusual shape. Normally wells, of course, are round. This one was associated with a Brickfield site, long gone now, of course. But there's probably 2 or 3 others on that area as well, because Brickfields used a tremendous amount of water. But the other thing that was dug from Kent in vast quantities was chalk. We often think of chalk as being extracted from huge open quarries like this one. This particular one I hate with a passion, because that became Blue Water Shopping Centre. I must admit, shopping is not my main interest. But ancient man took chalk out in a different way. Things called dene holes or chalk wells. It was the Victorians that first came up with the name dene holes for these small, vertically shafted chalk mines. In fact, the very first issue of Archaeologia Kantiana in 1858 contains an article on the discovery of ancient British, Romano-British and Roman pottery found in a chalk cavern in Camden Park, Chiselhurst. That small cavern at those times were called caverns or pits, but later on in Victorian times they were started to become dene holes. This is some pictures of dene hole shafts. The little sketch is a Victorian sketch of someone hanging on for dear life looking down a shaft. On the right is a typical medieval dene hole shaft. A row of footholds going down the sides, and the sketch on the left shows how the miner went up and down the shaft. The Victorians thought that those holes were meant to put a log across them so you could climb up and down the shaft with a ladder. But considering that shaft is only about 1 metre wide, you'd have to be very slim to climb up it. No, they were simply holds and footholds so the miner could climb in and out easily. The first ever sketch of a dene hole was made around 1610 for William Camden's Britannia, and it shows quite well really shafts going down and opening out into a set of little chambers at the bottom. They were dug to get chalk out for agriculture, because an application of crushed chalk on an acidic soil such as Thanet sand would sweeten the soil, as they called it, combat the acid, and the crops would grow better. Now, the Victorians were terribly, terribly interested in them. There's a picture of the Sidcup Literary and Scientific Society in 1895 going down a dene hole. The other one is some gentlemen looking at a dene hole at a field somewhere in Essex. Now, all the time they were looking at these dene holes and wondering what they were, they were coming up with some wonderful theories, such as animal pits, grain stores, but actually no, they just dug for chalk. And in fact, while they were arguing in their meetings, dene holes were still being dug. And they were still being dug in northern France in the 1930s. There's a chap with a windlass drawing up the buckets of chalk, and then someone spreading them on the land in little heaps, which somebody else would come along, break up with a sledgehammer, then the winter frost would break it up further, and the chalk would be ploughed in the following spring. A local antiquarian to Bexley called Flaxman John Spurrell was terribly interested in dene holes, and he set about investigating them. He wrote 2 quite good papers on them, although his conclusions were rather strange. But this is a plan of Joyden's Woods, Bexley, made by him in the 1880s. He was assisted by a young friend of his, a chap called Flinders Petrie, who shortly after went off to Egypt to make a name for himself as an Egyptologist. Now that plan shows the wood, and if you can see my marker, that is the Saxon boundary between Bexley and Dartford. All the other lines are medieval field banks. This little square, which used to be shown on Ordnance Survey plans as a Roman camp, is actually the deserted medieval village of Ockholt, owned by Lesnes Abbey. But every little dot on that plan shows a dene hole shaft, and most of them followed the lines of the field boundaries, except these 2 massive groups. There's far too much chalk came out of there to be used just for agriculture. They were used probably for building as well. The chalk coming out of the Cavey Springs group on the left probably went to Bexley Village, which is only about half a mile away to the northwest. It was used for foundations of buildings. Quite a few medieval buildings have got footings of chalk in Bexley. Also, 2 or 3 wells were lined with chalk blocks. The group to the right at Stanky Wood, the chalk from there probably went to the building of the Baldwin's estate, which is again about half a mile to the east. That's a sketch of one of the dene holes in the Stanky Wood area. The photograph shows somebody down them because that particular dene hole was still open in the 1960s. And that chap there holding the pressure lamp, the Tilly lamp, was the late John Cager, who did a lot of work on surveying and recording dene holes. The other figure to the side of the pillar is me, aged about 14. I started young. These are typical dene hole chambers. The top one shows a bench at the back, which some Victorians thought were Druids' altars. They're not, they're just simply platforms the miner would stand on to carry on cutting the chalk forward. Now, one thing about most dene holes is the chambers are very short, because nobody had got any underground transport down there. The chalk was cut out from the working phase, put into a basket attached to a rope, and it would be hauled up to the surface directly from the working face. So as the moved forward, the friction at the base of the shaft by the hauling rope would get tighter and tighter until it got so tight they couldn't haul up the chalk anymore. At that point, the dene hole was abandoned. So all the talks of tunnels going for miles and miles from a dene hole shaft are unfounded. They only go sort of about 10-15 meters. The one on the right is a later version of a dene hole called a chalk well. In these, a wheelbarrow was used. This is probably 17th century, this one. Wheelbarrows didn't start to be used in vertically accessed chalk mines in Kent to around about the 14th century. But that one on the right is on the Lees Court estate. Beautiful condition, and one of the few that are still accessible. Now, when they finished mining the chalk and spreading it on the land, they really didn't want an open hole to interfere with ploughing. So the traditional way of stopping one up was to throw a bush or tree stump down there and then backfill it with all the material you dug out of the shaft. Around Gravesend area, for some reason, they put flint walls at the bottom of the shaft. And in the later versions, the chalk wells from 17th century onwards, they often put a brick or flint cap. Now that's all very well, but sooner or later, bush or tree stump will rot away. And then you have a column of compacted earth standing on absolutely nothing. And sooner or later, it will collapse, bringing the dene hole to life again. These two are in a field. But unfortunately, they don't always turn up in fields, because many of the old medieval farms are now built on. Sometimes they turn up in back gardens. As well as chalk for on the land, chalk was also burnt for lime, for making lime mortar and lime wash. Some of the mines got quite extensive. This one is at Chiselhurst, not the famous Chiselers Caves, but about half a mile north of them. It's much more extensive than the dene hole. Underground transport such as barrows were used, and a form of mining known as pillar and stall, where tunnels were dug and other tunnels dug at right angles, leaving large square pillars to support the roof. This one was dug for lime burning, and also quite a bit of the chalk from this particular mine went to making the railway embankments at Chiselhurst. That's one of the galleries of the mine. The two members of the Kent Underground Research Group doing a graffiti survey. Recording graffiti nowadays is quite important. One time it was just dismissed. But of course it brings up the question, how much of the graffiti do you record? Do you just record the old stuff, or all the modern stuff such as Kilroy was here, or Manchester United rules okay, and all the rude stuff? We've taken the view that record absolutely everything. Chalk was also used for brickmaking, and that little inset photograph shows some yellow stock bricks. Now they're either called Kent stock bricks or London stock bricks, depending where you are. Sort of west of Dartford, they tend to be the London bricks, and east Kent stock bricks. Now it was chalk which gave those bricks their colour, between about 7 and 10% chalk was added to the clay to make the bricks. And they became very prominent in Victorian times, when with the coming of the railways, towns were expanding and a lot more building was taking place and millions of bricks were needed. So virtually anywhere a small bit of clay could be exposed and burnt for bricks was done so, and hundreds of little brickfields sprang up. But of course they wanted chalk to add to the mix, and they wouldn't want to pay to bring it far from a quarry, so almost all of them had chalk mines dug under the brickfield. This is one at Shepherd's Lane, Dartford, owned by a chap called Kidd, who owned a large brewery in the town. It's quite extensive, pillar and stall mining again, operating from about 1850 to about 1910. It was sealed up, forgotten, and then in the 1980s, Dartford Borough Council decided they wanted to get rid of a bit of surplus land, which was just scrub, had I think a scout's hut on it. They started doing the paperwork searches, and they discovered to their horror mention of a chalk mine on the site. So they started to look for it. They got a JCB on site, and what they uncovered was this well shaft. So then they wondered if the well shaft actually connected with the mine. Well, all the plans said it did, but they were unsure. So they devised all sorts of methods to finding out. And they decided what they would probably do was drop down a closed circuit television camera to have a look. It was around this time that my colleague Harry Pearman and I got involved, and we said, well, we'll go down and have a look. That hadn't occurred to anybody. So after signing a very fiercely worded indemnity form, we went down the well shaft and got into the mine. Absolutely beautiful condition. Now, the reason the well shaft connected with the mine is that in 1920, the borough engineer of Dartford decided that this chalk mine would make a very good soakaway to drain a load of the roads around Dartford. So a sewer was put in to connect to the top of the well shaft, and about 4 miles of road were drained into the mine, and still do. That's some of the underground chambers. Beautiful arch shape, which gives it a very strong mechanical cross section. And you can see the tide line there. That's the height at which it floods in heavy rain. Fortunately, it wasn't raining on the time we were there. You can also go underground for building stone. Now, if you think of building stone in Kent, you immediately think of Kentish ragstone. And you would think that most of it came from the huge open quarries around Hythe and Maidstone, which had been worked from Roman times. And that's quite true. But sometimes, for local work, they actually went underground. This is a plan of an underground quarry, or a series of underground quarries near Westerham. Now, I always used to call it a ragstone quarry, but I was taken to task by a geologist. Apparently, it's not ragstone because the lime content is not high enough. So can only call it a hard building stone. I don't think the people who dug it knew that, because it was used in all the local buildings. There's some photographs of the chambers in there, or galleries. The ragstone is the dark layer at the bottom. It's the hardest stone. who started from probably the early 17th century, which is the ones at the top at the north, worked right the way down to the last one, Series 6 at the bottom, and Series 5, which are thought to have been dug in 1914 to make some new cottages on the nearby common. The method of working was just to dig straight in from the hillside or quarry face, to straight into the hillside with just a few joining passages. Another underground ragstone quarry at Maidstone, one of a number, shows a totally different way of working. What looks like random, odd moving passages are actually passages through a load of dead material, because the miners only want the good stone. They didn't want all the waste stone that went with it. So in this case, they took out large quantities of stone and kept the roof up with putting the old stone, the waste material called deads, and walling it up behind dry stone walling. So the passages you see there are just walkways through to the end working faces. That's some of the dry stone walling. It's very fissured and many cracks in that particular quarry. My colleague is standing under half a ton of rock, which is held up by sheer willpower. I didn't tell him that until after I took the photograph. Now, sand mining. How can you mine sand? It will just fall in. But no, sand has been extensively mined in Kent and in Surrey. Normally the Folkestone beds of the lower greensand. It stands up quite well, having tunnels dug in it. This is a rather elaborate entrance to a sand mine at Chipstead near Sevenoaks. It was dug to get sand out to use in association with the whiting works in the 1880s. And there's some of the galleries. The brickwork around the bottom of the pillars were put in World War II as it was used as an air raid shelter. Wonderful condition again, but it's very odd when you're surveying it and you take the tape to the end of a gallery. You can push the tape in a couple of inches into the soft sand walls. There are extensive mines around mudstone sand, around Newnham Court and near the Great Danes Hotel. That one was even open to the public briefly in the 1960s by the owner of Chiselers Caves, who opened it to the public. Now, the second reason for digging holes in the ground was because you want space. For instance, here, an odd little thing, an underground chapel. This is St Nicholas at Wade, accessed by the cellar of a house, made of chalk blocks, beautifully built. It's thought to be late medieval. There was another one near Manston, known as Nash Court Cave, and that one was actually in Archaeologia Kentiana, volume 22 of 1878. There was a brief mention of it. Sadly, I've been told it's completely fallen in now. I'm sure you all recognise that aerial photograph of Canterbury Cathedral. Now, you wouldn't think there's much underground in Canterbury Cathedral, but there is. There's what's known as the Great Drain. The blue line is the drain which goes round the cathedral, goes across through the town wall, and originally discharged into the town ditch. It's now piped and goes into the Stour. It actually takes all of the water from the roof of the cathedral and has done for a considerable length of time. It was Prior Wibbert between 1390 and 1411 which brought in the first water supply to the cathedral from springs to the north. And he also started the drain. This was completed and extended by a Prior Goldstone in the 15th century. And it's still there, and it's still taking the water. It's been repaired a number of times. One on the left, you can see various types of stone, Tudor brickwork, Cairn stone at the bottom, flint, chalk blocks. The little opening to the left is one of the chutes which goes up to the roof of the cathedral that brings the water down. In another section, there's some beautiful pipework, lead pipework, and it's actually built into the drain, almost contemporary with the drain, and this very possibly is part of Prior Wibbert's original pipework. We didn't dare turn off that stopcock. While we're on the subject of water, ice wells. Before the coming of refrigerations and large estates, if you wanted to keep your drinks nice and cool, you had ice collected in the winter. This is one at Lees Court. Fairly standard design, a largish brick-lined pit, which would be filled with layers of ice and straw. The entrance passage always faced north, so the sun wouldn't go on it, and earth piled on the top. Now, in most big estates, the ice would be taken off local ponds or lakes. If there wasn't any lakes, you could use compacted snow, or you could have ice imported, because ice importation was a great business. In 1884, the UK imported 3,000 tons of ice, no, 300,000 tons of ice from Norway alone. So it's rather big business. In towns where people wanted to store ice, they'd use modified cellars. But in Gravesend, it was rather an odd one. This is a classic ice well type, but in the middle of a town. This one, a hole collapsed in a place called Horns Yard to the north of Gravesend Market in 2001. And we went to have a look at it, and it was this classic ice well. What had happened in desperately trying to remember. Yes, 1850, there was a large fire in that area of Gravesend which destroyed much of the houses and buildings there. And whilst they were rebuilding it, somebody had an idea to build this ice well. And we know it was when it was all the buildings were finished. We know that in 1884 it was a fishmonger that had the building next to it. And there were the two entrances. There was a stairway which went up to the cellar of the fishmongers, and there was another sloping entrance which went up to the yard, in which probably had where the ice was delivered. And the big other reason is for going underground is for shelter. First people to shelter is thousands of years ago. Oldbury Rock Shelter is dated to Middle Paleolithic. When we think of shelter, we more likely think of this. This is World War I damage in Ramsgate after a Zeppelin dropped some bombs. Now, Britain came under attack from Zeppelins in the First World War, and then in 1917, an even worse threat was the Gotha heavier-than-air bombers, which took a higher load, and bombing started in earnest, and people started digging underground shelters. This is a wonderful photograph from the Daily Mirror from 1917, showing a group of volunteers digging a dugout, as they were called, somewhere in southern England. We think that's somewhere in the Dover area. It was obviously very posed. Those ladies' shoes don't look as though they've been digging chalk for a couple of hours. Because in 1917, a lot of the shelters were do-it-yourself shelters. Local volunteers came together to dig shelters. In that, a letter was sent out by the Chief Constable of Ramsgate for volunteers to dig shelters for the population. This one was discovered in 2012 when they were starting to do some footings for Astor, I believe. Strange shape, says tunnel comes in, goes around in a loop, back out again. 2 or 3 on Thanet have got that same shape. Quite small, enough for a sort of couple of dozen people in there. Little bench cut in the side so you could sit down. The larger shelters were dug by professionals, usually the army, local army, the tunnelling companies, which came down to help out. This is one that was dug by the army for the Ellington School at Ramsgate. The old school was pulled down, and whilst they were setting out some footings for some new buildings, a hole was found which led into the shelter. Much more orderly plan. And in beautiful condition again. Used in First World War and also in the Second. You can see there the remains of wooden supports for bench seats. Unfortunately, the bench seats and the electric lighting was taken out after the Second World War. But when you went down into the shelter, you were expected to carry on doing your schoolwork. So we're not quite sure how many essays the chap had to write, having done this graffiti on the wall. A beautiful drawing of Popeye, done in 1944. Virtually any tunnel that could be found, could be used as a shelter, was used. These are some at Dover. Some were dug in World War II as shelters, others had been there previously. The one on the right shows people leaving the shelter after a night underground. On the right, there's some children in bunks in the damp and cold. Whole factories had shelters underground. This one is at Northfleet. There were sort of tentative plans to try and preserve these ones and open them to the public, but I fear that's got bogged down and nothing happens. There are other ones for the Shorts factory at Rochester, and they could, it was said they could evacuate the whole of the Esplanade factory into the tunnels behind in 4 minutes. I never believed that until I actually went down them, and it's true, they're very extensive. Now, it's not just people you want to shelter. You want to shelter material, and in this case, documents. Just before the Second World War, the Woolwich Building Society decided to up sticks and go down near Westerham. And they dug this underground shelter as a document store for all their deeds for mortgages, etc. long sloping entrance went up to the surface with a couple of access shafts for emergency access. When we went to have a look at it, only that shaft there was still accessible. There's a lady from the Kent History Forum descending it. Now, unfortunately, those tunnels were only expected to last a few years, and they're not very good condition at the moment, because they line the walls with simple plasterboard, which is now almost rotten and falling away. The picture on the left shows it in use with all the documents. So if anybody listening to this has got a house which had deeds from the Woolwich Building Society in World War II, they almost certainly would have been in that store. The entrance shaft to it is now completely sealed and it's inaccessible. Now the military went underground. That's the cliff face at Dover, where you can clearly see the entrances to tunnels. I do wish I'd kept the letter I received from the Ministry of Works in the 1970s, because I wrote to them at Dover Castle asking, would it be possible to have a look at the tunnels and the cliff under Dover Castle? And I was told in no uncertain terms that there were no tunnels in the cliff at Dover. Well, you can plainly see them, but at the time they were fitting them out as a regional seat of government in the Cold War, so you can, I suppose, see what they were getting at. There are 3 levels of tunnels there. The first one was ever dug was called Casemate, the blue one there. That was dug in Napoleonic times to house men and officers as an underground barracks. World War II, it was taken over and used as an operations centre. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, was undertaken from tunnels in casemate level. They then wanted to build or dig a large combined operations centre, which was going to be known as bastion level, which was going to be around here, above casemate, slightly below what became annex. Unfortunately, they had a number of roof falls. There's a rumour that one of the tunnelling company engineers was killed in a roof fall, and it was sealed off and abandoned. It's still there. Occasionally the sort of people, experts, go down there and try and have a look for it, but as yet is inaccessible. Next was dug was annex level as a dormitory and first aid station, and then finally Dumpy level in 1942. Annex level and casemate level are open to the public and well worth a visit. Dumpy level sadly isn't because of accessibility. It's only accessible by a very steep staircase or a 1963 lift, which takes 4 people at a time. As well as these tunnels, there were plans for other tunnels under the cliffs, carrying on the alphabet with annex at the top, casemate, bastion, dumpy. There's going to be esplanade level at the level at the bottom of the cliffs, and then foundation level under that. They were never ever built. That's a 3D of the tunnels. Sebastian was going to be actually quite huge, but as I say, all sealed off now. There were some plans to open Dumpy level to the public by putting a ramp on the outside of the cliffs and going down. But of course, that would take incredible amount of money, and sadly English Heritage is a bit short of cash at the moment. But while we're in the area of Dover, this is an aerial photograph of Dover looking from the north. And not many people know that from here a whole series of tunnels goes out. Because when it was thought that the French were going to land, it was decided that the northern part of Dover Castle was the most vulnerable to underground mining. So these countermines were dug, 2 sets on 3 levels. The idea was you would have men stationed in them, and if they heard people tunnelling towards them, all the ends of those tunnels would be filled with barrels of gunpowder. And the nearer the French came, when it was obvious they were quite close, somebody would light the blue touch paper and run extremely fast to the access shaft, where the explosions would destroy the enemy mines. Luckily, it was never ever used. So, some of the parts I've shown you aren't accessible easily by people, and many are sealed just after we've visited. But you can go underground to see some examples of what we've been talking about. And also some wonderful things to see. The Shell Grotto at Margate. If you've never been, please do so. An enigmatic little thing with about 4.5 million shells adorning the roof, roofs, walls, everywhere. Well worth a visit. An example of a small chalk mine dug for lime burning is Margate Caves, which after being shut for quite a time had been reopened, sadly only to fall victim to the pandemic. So hopefully they should be open later in May. They were rediscovered in 1807, and the owner of the land turned them into his private grotto. It had lots of pipes on the walls, etc. Even dug 2 ice wells underground. But again, it's well worth a visit if you're in the area. If you want to see a really large chalk mine dug for lime burning, there's the famous Chiselers Caves. This is a view of the map in the map room underground. You can see caves are marked Saxons, Druids and Romans. That's because a rather eccentric archaeologist called Dr. William Nichols went down there and published a couple of papers in 1903 and 4 and decided they were dug by the Romans, Druids and Saxons. Sadly not. They were mainly of 18th and 19th century development, but well worth a visit. They're guided tours, go in every hour. You get a hurricane lamp to hold. You can only go by guided tours, and the guides are quite entertaining. And military tunnels, apart from Dover, there's Fan Bay to the east of Dover, National Trust property. It was an underground shelter, first aid station for a gun battery, one of the coastal gun batteries. There were quite a few of these shelters, many of them now sealed off, unfortunately. And one of the biggest ones you can see is at Ramsgate. Before the Second World War, Ramsgate started building this tunnel system under the town. Absolute massive undertaking. It could take up to 60,000 people, and part of it is now open to the public, and again well worth a visit. The entrance to it now down the bottom left goes in through an old railway tunnel. One of the entrances at the top left, as it was during the war. And some of the tunnels had bunks in. This is little Johnny being tucked up. Tunnels are still there. Well worth it. Now, this evening I haven't been able to show you all the types of sites there are out there. Otherwise we'd be here for a considerable time. But I hope it's given you just an idea of what can be there. And finally, if you're on an archaeological field walk or something, you come across a bit of field that looks like this, do take care. Don't let Granny jump up and down on it, because it could turn into that. But if it does, do let us know, because we'd like to go down and have a look at it. And I think that's about it. Anybody got any questions?
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Rod. That was really fascinating and wonderful visuals. There are a few questions. Just on the two for me, just quickly on the Woolwich kind of sort of archive that you showed. I mean, I presume all those documents were taken out. They weren't all just left there. And on shell, right, and on the shell grotto, you know, there's lots of speculation on the history of that grotto. Do you have any personal opinion about how old it is? And you know, it's a very mysterious sort of place. So I remember going there a few years ago. It was like from the Phoenicians and things like this. What do you think it's from?
Yes. Well, I don't think it was the Phoenicians. I think that's one of the lovely things about the shell grotto is no one is absolutely sure. If I had to guess, I'd say it probably started life as something like a very small dene hole, 3-chambered dene hole, which was then expanded and then decorated. But in some respects, it'd be a shame if it was found out, because it's such a lovely little site. And well, no, they didn't leave the the stuff in. They've all taken back to Woolwich after the war, all the records.
Good. Right. So we've got some questions here. Any new ideas? So this is from David White. Any new ideas on the well at Salmston? Is that Salmston or Salmston's Grange? I don't know. Do you have any kind of? And the second one from Rosemary Hubbard is, why are they called dene holes? What's the reason for that?
The Salmston Grange, I'm sure one of our chaps has got some stuff on that, but for the top of my head, I can't remember. I'm sorry. Dene holes. Well, I'd say it was the Victorians that started using it. The word dene means wooded valley. Hole is, well, hole. So dene hole, hole in a small wooded valley. There's some of them are in shallow valleys. Perhaps that's reasonable. The older writers just called them pits, or chalk wells, chalk holes, draw pits, you know. But dene holes sounded more romantic, so I suppose the Victorians used it. Good.
And now, I think this is a comment, but you might want to comment on the comment from Mary Lynn. The Woolwich headquarters at Bexley Heath apparently also used to store deeds in a huge underground store. The deeds were protected by an inert gas, and there was a robot that accessed the boxes of documents. I used to look after the computer system that serviced it. It became redundant after the dematerialization of deeds in 2003. I don't know if you knew anything about that. That's
no,
and then
no,
and then
I didn't actually. I knew in the Woolwich site, when the Bexley Heath site was sort of demolished, I know they found a load of cesspits, old medieval cesspits, etc. there. But I didn't know they stored stuff in an inert gas. I assume it was argon or something like that. Well, no, that's not inert. No,
Great.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know. Now there's a question here about from Gillian about why is it that wells are round? Does that shape make for stronger structure?
Yes, it is stronger. A circle is a very strong mechanical shape, so the pressure from the sides of the earth pressing on it as after it was dug kept it rigid. Also, it was the easiest to dig. A chap would sit in the bottom with a small pick and just cross-legged and just go round and round in circles almost, and just keep going down, using the bucket on a rope as a plumb bob. I don't particularly like wells. They're always full of carbon dioxide.
Good. And then this is from James Leach. He thanks you for the interesting talk. It was interesting to learn, he says, about the chalk mines association with Brickfields. And he asks, are there any public books or publications that provide further information about these mines and Brickfield that you might suggest for further reading?
Sadly not. There were so many of these Brickfields, and if they were making yellow stocks, there would have been a chalk mine very nearby, almost certainly under it. If you look at some of the large-scale ordnance survey, about 25-inch to the mile, often they mark shafts or little circles. Sometimes they call them wells. And a lot of them, unfortunately, were built over. I'd be very loath to talk too much about where they were because they'd scare the heck out of people. But sadly, there is nothing written on them. A few mines have been recorded and written up. I mean, the Dartford one is on the KAS website, but not many.
And then in terms of accessibility, there's a point by someone saying that now and then English Heritage have a members' day where you were taken on a guided tour around Dumpy, and it was well worth a visit. I don't know if you are aware of that. Dumpy, I presume, is...
Yes, occasionally Dumpy you can get down. I've been down it a few times with the curator years ago. It would be lovely to see it opened up even more, but unfortunately they just can't get the number of people down there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rod. You kindly said if anyone finds a sort of hole opening up in their garden or somewhere like that, then you would be available, presumably not yourself to go down, but one of your team.
No, I tend to go in the walk around ones now.
So you're sort of retired from the sort of front line, but still active behind the scenes. So that's the main thing.
Right. Yep.
Well, look, we're really grateful for the talk you gave tonight. I mean, it was really fascinating. Thank you very much. This will go online in the next few days. So do please like it and kind of leave any comments and any other questions. I'm sure if you were to leave them, then we'd be very happy to kind of pass them on to Rod. There is a number of other talks coming up. I'll put them up here. So we've got one, in fact, in May, our own Steve Willis again. There's one at the end of this month, that's all up here, and then another one in June and July. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. This is part of our aim to kind of educate, inform and engage with issues around the history and the archaeology of Kent. I'm sure you'll agree that was a really fascinating talk by Rod, who has not only kind of investigated these kind of often very difficult to access features, but has written about them and tonight expertly lectured on them. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. Good night.